external dynamics that we need to take into consideration if we're going to get the highest performance out of teams in our organizations. Specifically, we're going to look into the idea of collaboration barriers. This particular content, some of these elements are definitely drawn from a variety of research perspectives, but when it comes to both looking at barriers to collaboration in organizations and some potential levers or interventions to improve collaboration, I'm drawing a great deal on Morten Hansen's work. Morten is a professor at UC Berkeley and has written extensively about how organizations can think about designing themselves to be better at collaboration and to support collaboration. So we're starting to move in this video away from just thinking about individual teams to thinking about designing organizations for better collaboration overall. And teams are really a foundational basis for that. And we'll look at some of the things that get in the way of collaboration in this video, think about the role teams are playing, but then think about some challenges moving into the idea of organizations that are team-based that still need to be addressed to overcome these problems. Simply making teams will not reduce. So the not invented here syndrome, which many of you have probably heard of before. But basically, in a general scope or general sense, this is just sort of an unwillingness to learn from others. So if we think about external activities, not invented here would come into play as a barrier to teams collaborating with other teams because they just don't believe that anyone else has the same set of circumstances or same set of problems as they do, and therefore some kind of external knowledge will not actually be helpful. So that's the general sense of the not invented here syndrome. The textbook talks about some other things that are kind of interesting variations of this, which is a kind of odd thing that sometimes if knowledge is extremely outside, so coming from a competitor, for example, outside the organization, that sometimes we may be more willing to accept that as valid versus from another team inside of our organization. So there's some kind of funny ways that people tend to think about valuing the source of knowledge or valuing knowledge based on the source. So some of the general causes of not invented here organizationally that Hansen has identified are having an insular culture. And if we think about that inside of just a single team, that is that overbounded inward-looking culture where we think what we're working on is so unique and so special we can't bother to learn something from somebody outside of us. Now, larger organization-wide, some organizations have the same feeling, and as a result, it may be difficult to get collaboration happening across units or divisions of organizations if there's this sense that, we don't really need to know something. Some other reasons that sometimes we don't see people accepting external knowledge is a status gap. So a concern that if I have to reach out and ask for something that I'm going to reveal some ignorance on my part. And so some team members may want to hide the fact that they're not solving the problem themselves. Some organizations have a culture that really emphasizes fixing it yourself and not looking for help from outside. That's going to be another way and reason why organizations fail to benefit from having teams, because people will not cross those boundaries and transfer knowledge and learn from the experiences of other teams in the organization. That self-reliance norm is something I just mentioned, that there's a sense you need to fix it yourself, solve your own problems, not look for help. And then just sometimes straight up fear of what will happen if you use other knowledge, fear of what happens if you reveal that you need help. So if we think ahead, we're going to talk about team-based organizations and teaming. We've already had that conversation about psychological safety for internal team learning. It applies in organizations as well. If we want better collaboration across team boundaries, we need to reduce the sense of fear that might arise if people feel like they have to admit there's an error or admit ignorance or admit needing help. Another barrier to collaboration that's common both between teams and within organizations is the hoarding problem or the unwillingness to help problem. And this is simply when people will not share information, will not share knowledge, will not share resources, because they fear that doing so will harm them, that they'll lose something that they might value, that it could take away from their own performance. And so some key causes of this that can happen both with teams and just in organizations in general is that there's competition set up between groups or divisions. A little hint ahead for Disney to think about in the traditional structure at the systems group. The traditional silos were like this, where leaders weren't given any uh, real benefit or incentive to give resources to another work group because all of their reward was based on their own performance and production, not on something across the whole organization. So these ideas of narrow incentives where rewards are really only given to you for your local work will create a problem. And so sometimes that can generate a challenge for a team if they feel like if they give up some of the knowledge they've produced or the discoveries they've made, that they may actually harm their own rewards or outcomes or compensation if somebody else learns something from them. So we have to think about how to resolve that in teams and in organizations. And then sometimes it's just not malicious at all. It's just that people are overloaded, they're overworked, and they're overbusy. And when we come back to the idea of multi-team membership and multi-team systems, we have to face the fact that a lot of the way organizational work is designed now creates a lot of this sort of role overload and overload of work where people have a very hard time having spare time or attention to offer to help others or to seek out help externally. And then, fear of losing power, that if you give up something of value, you'll lose power. So these are all dynamics that might lead to this idea of hoarding and not sharing information across teams and within organizations. A third significant barrier to collaboration in organizations is what we could think of as the needle in a haystack problem, or this is the inability to find information or know where to locate it. So even if a team or unit in an organization realizes that it needs help or it believes there might be a solution elsewhere in the organization, they may just not know where to start, who to ask, who might know that information. And so these kinds of problems are elevated in very large organizations. Some of the places you may work, if they're large, globally dispersed organizations, it's reasonable to think somebody has solved the problem you're facing now, but it can feel like a significant barrier to figure out where to look for that. Even if you have some sense through some infrastructure or information systems about where that might be, we're going to come to one of the next problems, which is you may not have the relationship to be able to do that. You might not be able to ask. You might be able to ask, but nobody will pay attention to you. So part of that is, the poverty of networks, and we'll come back to that as well. We've sort of discussed that a little bit as another team staffing thing to think about, which is, do people have the right networks for this kind of cross-unit, cross-team collaboration required? So finally, I think this is a related problem. So we might think about the stranger problem, and this could be that you just have difficulties, that there are frictions, there are past problems, there are competitions between teams or units or divisions of organizations that prevent people from feeling like they can actually get what they need. They may actually know where there's information, but may not be able to have the influence to get that information. Also, sometimes there's tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that's not easily written down or codified or communicated. It's something that you might need to demonstrate to somebody. And it might be much harder to access people and have them demonstrate an answer to your problem. Likewise, if you don't have kind of a common mindset or common frame, it's difficult to know that you actually have something that could benefit one another, and that might create a division or a barrier to be able to transfer that knowledge or gain learning in the organization or across teams. These barriers to collaboration challenge team external dynamics. They confront teams and make it difficult for them to engage in external learning processes that we've demonstrated are important to team performance for a local team. But these collaboration problems are also a core reason why organizations move to team-based structures in the first place. So traditional structures, I have a picture of grain silos here. We traditionally think about the classic hierarchy where we have what we call silos, and we have functional groups or product groups working together, and they have their reporting structure of managers and people under those managers, and these may be teams inside of these groups, but they're still fairly internal. They're still fairly insulated inside of their silos, and they have their reporting structures, and they have their goals and rewards that they may be trying to achieve in each of these structures, right? Going kind of upwards here. And basically, the classic silo problem is the collaboration barrier, right? That it's hard to get information to flow horizontally across the organization because people are worried about pleasing the leaders in their pyramid. And so these structures are often some of the biggest barriers to collaboration, and a reason why teams are often used in organizations. And some of my own research supports this idea that traditional structures can create problems for team learning, both internal and external learning. So I shared research before that I did independently. I shared research before that my colleague Henrik did independently, and he's one of the co-authors on the book of X Teams. But Henrik and I have also done some work together, and that should not say forthcoming. That paper has been out now for a couple of years. But basically, this research looked at, again, in the pharmaceutical industry. So these are high-tech, high-ambiguity innovation teams in pharmaceutical development. And what we wanted to look at was, what was the kind of role of internal structure versus organizational structure, and what effect did that have on learning in the teams? And just kind of as a quick summary, what we found was that if there was more internal structure, so, good structure within the team, those roles, responsibilities, leadership, standard processes and planning in place, those teams engaged in much more learning, both internal and external learning behaviors. What we found, though, was that if there was a lot of organizational structure, kind of classic siloed pyramids, that teams did less internal and external learning in those situations. And in particular, if there was a combination of high internal and high external structure, high organizational structure, those teams did the least amount of learning, internal or external. The only situation where this was kind of an opposite case was that if the teams did not have internal structure, if they were not designed and launched well with good internal structures, then if they were in a classic pyramid or hierarchy, they tended to engage in more learning, more internal learning, not as much external learning. So that makes some sense that they're getting better at figuring out their own internal processes if they have that strong support structure of their own silo or pyramid, but there's still a barrier across to collaborate with other teams or other units. So the key takeaway on this is that one thing we might need to think about is what is the organizational structure surrounding the team, and aspects of the way the organization is designed may inhibit these kinds of external learning behaviors. But we can also think about some additional collaboration levers in general. And of course, one is just using teams. So if we have teams that in particular are going to bridge the silos. So if we have our organizational divisions and silos here, one thing we saw was that those teams that are inside of these strong structures don't engage in as much learning. But one thing that organizations often do then is create horizontal teams that bridge several different functional areas. And this will come back to, but is traditionally the matrix organization. So where we have a classic functional design in the organization for some degree of specialization and control, but then we set up these horizontal teams to try to generate more collaboration. And generally speaking, doing this does improve collaboration and reduce collaboration barriers. But we can go even more extreme and think about reorganizing to a full team-based structure, which we'll come back to in another lecture. Another key lever to elevate collaboration are unification values and common goals. So trying to create a sense of identity that's bigger than an individual team or an individual unit, so that people see that their contributions are more than just to that internal learning process, but they are aiding larger organizational outcomes and organizational goals. It's creating some kind of a common fate that supersedes what an individual team is working on, so that there's a sense that sharing and collaborating across those team boundaries is actually going to benefit something more important in a larger outcome and a larger vision. Now, this will not effectively work if the goals are still set up in a competitive manner and if there's a zero-sum game for accessing resources. So it's not going to really help you very much to sort of spout goals that are higher level goals if all of the organizational alignment doesn't help support that. So, ways to evaluate this from Morton's work, you could ask, and see to what extent you'd agree with these statements. Do we have a common goal that the whole organization seems to feel like we're going toward? Do we have a value? Does the organization truly value teamwork and collaboration? For instance, are people promoted based on their skills effectively leading teams? That would give you a clue about how important teamwork is in the organization. Are our leaders communicating the value and need to collaborate and to sort of work across boundaries and to exercise this kind of team external activity and team learning? And do we see modeling of collaboration in our own leaders? If we look at leaders in our business unit or division, do we see them modeling these kinds of collaborative behaviors, or are they modeling insular competitive behaviors? So in addition to setting up teams or even going as far as a team-based organization, ensuring that there are common goals and shared values that push people to think beyond their local team and local problems. Another thing that we have to think about organizationally is, are we developing the skill set in our people to make the best kind of teamwork collaborators in our organization? So we can think about this working both inside of an individual team, that having so-called T-shaped people can really help the team perform better, but T-shaped people also really help bridge across teams, across the organization, because these people, what T-shaped means is that people have a combination of deep specialty in their functional area, but then they also have experiences that let them be general, that they understand different divisions, they understand different functions, they understand how pieces of the organization work together. And so some, ways to get this is to make sure that there are reward and training and incentive structures for people to actually be promoted if they develop these kinds of skills. So think about, what would create this? What kinds of structures and design of rotation of people could expose them to not just their own silo or not just their own pyramid, but give them the opportunity to learn from others and learn about other areas, so that they recognize the connecting points across the organization and between teams. The one thing about this has to be to think about, do we select the right kind of people in our organizations? Do we staff the teams with the right kind of people? And do we give people the experiences they need to get to be T-shaped people? And Hansen talks about, that there's two different kinds of problems, people who don't really fit this mold to be T-shaped and support collaboration. We can have so-called cowboys, the sole actors, the do-it-yourself people, the self-promoting people. And we can have butterflies who are very good at sort of flitting around and understanding, different parts of the organization, but they never execute anything. It's almost like that difference between overbounded and underbounded. The cowboys are kind of, they're overbounded. They're sort of solely focused on their own individual problem. The butterflies are seeing, problems all over the place and can't really execute anything. So if we want to think about organizations, what we'd like to ultimately get are these T-shaped people up here. They are high individual performers. They are deep experts in their own area, but they also engage in good cross horizontal company contributions. They've had the experience to understand, they have the networks to connect and to be able to deliver across the organization. So if we think about, and finally, we need to think about collaboration levers using networks. And I've brought this up in a couple different places, but it's thinking about the social capital of the people you are having on your team, and do they have contacts in the right other parts of the organization? Do they have relationships that they can leverage to help you bridge those gaps across your groups and your organization? So over here, there's a little bit of stuff over here, but if you've had my other class, you've learned about structural holes or brokerage positions. It's important to try to find some of those people, because those will be the best boundary spanners, those people who sit across a couple different networks. I was trying to draw a picture, then I didn't succeed, but they sit within a couple specific network positions and bridge into different groups. So again, it's a way to think about, going back to the very beginning of class, when we think about composition and staffing the team, we want to be looking for T-shaped people. We want to be developing T-shaped people, and we want to have people on our teams who have extensive networks, who bridge structural holes, and who have strong ties into important stakeholder groups, both to gain resources and to kind of sell outbound for the team to support these kinds of external activities across the team boundary.